All right, we're recording now. Welcome, everybody. I'm Helen Blier. I'm usually running the tech on these things, but this time I get to be on the main screen. I serve as, as the president of ALUM and direct the CLL, the Center for Lifelong Learning at Columbia Theological Seminary. Just so you know, we're recording this. The recording will be accessed from the member portal for ALUM members. Just to get a sense of who's on the screen, it's a small group today. Just drop your name and where you're zooming in from into the chat so that we can have a sense of who all is here. Since I'm paying attention to other things and we're a small group today, just go ahead, unmute or raise your hand and ask questions along the way, since it's going to be challenging for me to be able to monitor the chat as well as pay attention to you, the presentation, and anything else that's going on. And a special thanks to my Alum Exec members who are here today. I've called this particular slideshow Lessons from the Sankofa Bird. And this Sankofa is a Twi expression, Sankofa, whose literal meaning is to go back and get it. As you can see, the Sankofa bird, it has its feet pointed in one direction and its head is turned and it's looking behind. It's a command to pay attention to what has gone before us, what is in our past, in order to inform future action. You'll see that the bird also has a ball or an egg in its beak. This is intended to signify what is generative and life-giving, hence the egg, from the past that is worth bringing forward into our future. We can't bring everything, but we should be mindful enough to know what is worth remembering in order to inform future action. And that's pretty much what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be taking a look at the origin story of this organization and framing it in the larger story of lifelong learning within the Christian community. And then we're going to ask, where are we headed and what is worth bringing with us? So the history of ALUM, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, working backwards. We now know ourselves to be a community of practice, a think tank, a resource, and an advocate for leaders in lifelong learning for ministry. This last word, advocate, was added by the exec this most recent gathering in January of 2026, as we took a look at the proliferation of lifelong learning programs, not just in theological schools, but broadly, and recognized that a lot of the people who participate in the programs and lead the programs are very aware of the worth and value of these programs. But the folks who are the gatekeepers to resources often do not understand the unique contribution these programs make to the overall work of theological education and faith formation. As a result, Alam has taken on for itself the responsibility of trying to message the importance so that those who are in leadership positions allocating resources, in particular to lifelong learning programs, can understand the unique value of these programs and allocate resources accordingly. So, going back to our origin, is it 1968-69 when our predecessor organization, SOCM, the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry, was formed? Does it go back to 1960 when the first executive secretary and pioneer of continuing education, Connolly Gamble, wrote the first comprehensive history of lifelong learning and continuing education in seminaries? Does it go back to the 1950s, post-World War II, when these programs were proliferating, exploding across theological schools and in denominational offices? Does it go back to 1934 when the first study of the effectiveness of seminary education was actually written? Brown and May did a study on the American pastor to take a look at what the shortcomings of traditional seminary education were. Or does it go back even further than that? So let's start with long, long ago in a galaxy, New York City, there was a gathering of National Council of Churches, the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry, was formed as a mandate of their division of ministry. They looked left, looked right, saw that there are a huge number of programs growing all over the place with no convening or cohering body to kind of oversee quality and consistency in these programs to support people who are in ministry. And as a result, this organization was formed serving largely mainline Protestant churches. Just so you know, there was a parallel organization that was set up within the Roman Catholic Church to help support all of the re-education of pastors after Vatican II, with all of the sea changes that happened with that council, and the rapid growth of lay ministry and the need to train up people to do lay ministry effectively in the Catholic Church. We were on the mainline Protestant side of that development. In 1960, Connolly Gamble, who was serving as the director of continuing education for Presbyterian Seminary, Union Presbyterian in Richmond, Virginia, did a landmark study that took a look at all of the continuing education programs for ministry that were developing in theological schools at that time. And what he found is more than 100 unique continuing education programs, primarily in theological schools and in denominational offices, but also in some freestanding retreat centers as well. And he said the growth in these programs has been so rapid, and we are beginning to understand that continuing education for ministry is absolutely crucial for ongoing um, effective functioning in ministry. It was an offshoot, as we'll see, of the professionalization of theological education for ministry formation. As a result of this study and two important councils that were held, one in 1964 at Andover Newton Theological Seminary of blessed memory, and the other in 1965 at the University of Chicago's Divinity School, the decision was made to put forth the idea of a convening body for all lifelong learning programs. So in 1969, the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry was formed. In the founding documents, the goal was to, quote, provide camaraderie and exchange of ideas with training for continuing educators, very few of whom in early days had been trained for their roles. If anybody on their screen, on this screen, had formal training to be a leader of continuing education or lifelong learning leadership, I would like you to use one of the emojis to raise your hand and affirm that. Oh, look, nobody's doing that. It was ever thus, as I like to say. The ups and downs of the history since then. In the 1970s, there was a rapid expansion of lifelong learning programs and support within the organization for leaders in lifelong learning for ministry or continuing education for ministry. If you think about what was going on at this time, a lot of folks newly gained access to ordination who had not been given access before. So it was a real glory day time for seminaries and theological schools. Women were being ordained. There was growth in the church. It was riding on the post-World War II baby boom expansion of the church. And with all of the changes that happened in the 1960s, there were a lot of folks who trained for ministry who said, hey, we need to update our ministry skills, constantly hone our effectiveness as ministers. And so the expansion was extremely pronounced during this time. One of the things that's important to note as well is that during these early days of SOCM, there was an annual convention held by SOCM that usually gathered between 150 and 200 professional leaders in lifelong learning for ministry. And at Auburn Seminary, a regular boot camp was held, a couple of week-long boot camp for leaders in lifelong learning and continuing education programs, so they could learn the best practices for leading these programs. Now, one of the things that's important to remember is even though new people were gaining access to ordination, ministry was still a fairly homogenous sort of thing. It was largely white churches that were being supported by SOCM, largely men, although not exclusively, full-time pulpit ministry in traditional congregations. In the 1980s is when things began to fall apart in terms of this very traditional understanding of church, seminary education, and the profile of what ministry looked like. This is also the rise of the evangelical movement, as we'll see. In the 90s, SOCM as an organization experienced a renewal after its initial contraction. Before its renewal, it decided to move away from having a full-time paid executive secretary since numbers were dropping and moved to an all-volunteer board. There was another contraction in the early aughts. As you can see, there's a sort of sine wave up and down of the organization itself, which is really a reflection of the ups and downs in theological education and ministry life. Through these rapid fluctuations, the organization sought to reinvent itself, and among other things, it went through a name change, going from the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry to the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, broadening the population of people who would find themselves included in this umbrella. And there's a return to the original mission of the organization. On the whole, lifelong learning for ministry has always been responsive to perceived needs in the ministry community. In the origins of the development of SOCM, it was responding to perceived gaps in seminary education. As those perceived gaps have changed over the years, and now we see theological education itself going through rapid change. Lifelong learning itself is going through rapid change as well. So we're going to do a little what's called a Mentimeter poll. You can either use your phone to scan the QR code, or Daryl has helpfully dropped the link to Mentimeter in the chat. I'd like you to respond to the question, what's the problem you're trying to address with your lifelong learning programming? And what I'll do is I'll stop sharing this particular screen and we'll go to the actual Mentimeter poll. So go ahead and type in your responses and they should appear here on the screen. Unless, of course, you're driving and should not be on your phone doing a poll like this. Okay, increased enrollment. Anything else? It's interesting that this should be the first one to have appeared on there. I'll make mention of that in just a moment. Sustaining clergy, skills, just-in-time learning, ongoing formation, increased enrollment again, progressive theology, relevance, lay education, access. Accessibility is now the number one. We've even got access as well as accessibility as two different things. Minister training. Updating, I'm assuming updating the skills and competencies of people who are doing ministry, sustaining clergy. This is really interesting. Accessibility means providing the goods and benefits of theological education to a broader audience, perhaps an audience that cannot access full-time degree program education. Sustaining clergy means taking folks who are doing ministry and continuing to support them in this work. Fantastic. I'm going to be saving this and I'll send it all to you folks um, after this webinar. Um, the question of increased enrollment. The Association of Theological Schools, ATS, has recently conducted some study into the motivations for theological schools to support lifelong learning, continuing education, and non-degree programs. And they're finding that according to leadership, the two primary reasons for supporting these programs are increasing enrollment in degree programs, and increasing revenue to the theological school, which means in this view, lifelong learning for ministry isn't its own good, serving its own community with its own mission and purposes. It is at the service of what has historically been perceived to be the gold standard way of delivering theological education, which is degree programs, particularly the MDiv program. This is not the origin story of lifelong learning for ministry, and it's not true to what the mission of non-degree programs is as well. Increasing numbers of people are not seeking degrees, but still want access to the goods of theological education, and lifelong learning programs provide that. Also, even in an old school approach to doing continuing education or lifelong learning for ministry, one would assume that the people who are accessing continuing education or lifelong learning would perhaps already have their degree. So the pipeline is actually kind of reversed in that thinking. This to us in Alam points to one of the key misunderstandings that leadership, particularly in theological schools and in denominational offices, have. This idea that somehow lifelong learning is to be serving the good of the degree program as opposed to being its own good and perhaps an alternative modality for receiving theological education. All right, going back to our slideshow here. Okay, here we go. The history of the education and formation in the faith, the Christian community is well informed by Justo Gonzalez's very important work, The History of Theological Education. It's a small, bite-sized little book that really lays out the changing trend of how education and formation have happened in theological education. And lifelong learning is a part of that story as well. So if we're really going to talk about the origin story of lifelong learning for ministry, we have to go way in the Wayback Machine to the very origins of formation and transformation as it has been understood and practiced within Christianity. Part of the subtext of that is attending to where deformation and malformation have happened too. In some ways, lifelong learning is the oldest new idea that people have come up with. People think of it as the great new thing, the new pathway for ministry, when really lifelong learning in this way has been happening since, around 33 in the Common Era, which is really the very, very beginning of the Christian community. And what we understand to be traditional theological education is, by contrast, a relatively recent phenomenon and development. So if we go back, let's just be conservative and go back to Constantine's conversion and the establishment of Christianity as the state religion in 312 CE. The timeline with equal spacing, as we're looking at it here, with equal amounts of time between the different bars, looks like this. But if we were to take a look at key moments in the development of lifelong learning for ministry. So Constantine was an important moment. The 13th century was an important moment. 1440s, we'll see the mid-16th century, and then the decades in the second half of the 20th century to contemporary time. As you can see, however, most of the changes in lifelong learning have happened since 1934, even more conservatively, the 1950s and 60s. So if we were to look at it to scale, we see that a whole lot didn't change in terms of the approach to lifelong learning and Christian formation for about 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden we have this blur that looks something like a barcode at the very end of the timeline here because so much has happened so rapidly. People talk about us going through unprecedented change these days. It's not the level of change we're experiencing that's unprecedented. In fact, historians will tell you it is the speed of the change that we're experiencing right now and the unprecedented number of things happening in close succession, which is leading people to feel like things are just sort of blowing up. So let's take a look at this history, shall we? The earliest Christian communities started forming after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the early 30s in the Christian era. This is when the Didache, the first document we have access to for Christian formation, was formed. And for those of you who don't know the Didache, it is a document that outlines how people are to be brought into and formed in this new community called the Way. People understood that living together, reflecting on life experience, and actually doing the practices of liturgical community were the key moments of formation, telling the stories, sharing meals, doing life with each other. This was a very organic, experiential approach to formation. And then you've got this going on for a little less than 300 years. And then you have Constantine's conversion. He has this experience of transformation, winning a battle under the sign of Christ. And therefore, because he's the emperor, everybody else has to convert as well. So you go from this organic, internally motivated formational approach to Christianity becoming the state religion and being obligatory for all people within the empire. You move from, so the focus on internal lived formation and a connection to lived experience pretty much ended with Constantine's conversion. Up until the 12th to 13th century, you have this sense of being formed by liturgical practice to a certain extent, but you don't really have access to the base communities as they did in the earliest part of the Christian community. In the 12th and 13th centuries, you've got the rise of scholasticism, the development of the first universities, Bologna, St. Charles University, Oxford University, and theology becomes a course of academic study rather than reflection on lived experience and becomes known as the Queen of the Sciences. This is also the time when Thomas Aquinas is doing his writing as well. So during this period, reflection on theology and Christianity and lived faith experience becomes pretty much the purview of educated elites. Now, note, this is not the same as formation of leaders in faith communities. That formation was different. Then in the 1440s, of course, you have the development of the first printing press. So you go from knowledge about Christianity and the basics of the Christian community and its foundations being either the purview of the educated elites in universities or monks and leaders of faith communities to transmitted by oral history or the artwork in Gothic cathedrals to a printing press. Huge epistemic shift here. Now, anybody who can read can have access to the Bible. It was as dramatic a conversion in epistemology as the internet is today and the wiki world, the what I know is world that we live in today. As you can imagine, people who were elite scientists in theology had real concern about the average person having access to scripture for fear that there's going to be misinformation or people would misinterpret things. Doesn't that sound familiar? Things pretty much develop in this direction until the 16th century when you have the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. At this point, you have people who are becoming familiar enough with the foundations of Christianity to say, hey, you know, maybe something is wrong here. Maybe something needs to be changed. And the Reformations, which were sparked by a number of years of epistemological change, of rapid political change in Europe and a different system of government in Europe, the establishment of the first, quote, seminaries, training centers for people who would be clergy and religious leadership, and clergy and laity are both being identified as having certain kinds of problems, think indulgences. So the response was to try to address this kind of misinformation, malformation, wrong direction that was happening in the faith communities. And so you have the first seminaries developing. Things remain largely unchanged during this period of time until 1960, the Vatican II Council. Now, one of the things Vatican II Council did was open up the experience of faith back to the local community. In the Roman Catholic Church, for example, the liturgical language was no longer Latin, it was the vernacular. In Protestant communities, they began to address the needs of local folks. This is also the time when, as we'll see, things like liberation theologies and various other liberation movements outside of the church are developing as well. So fast forward from this time to recent history, And you have all of this change coming to a head as people began to do some research. Um, One of the things that we see is people beginning to ask questions again about the adequacy of training for clergy through these seminaries that have their origin story back in the 16th century. 1934, the Brown-May study, led by Mark May, studied the education of American ministers. A group of ministers in New England were studied to look at the efficacy of their training in theological school for the things that they were expected to do while in the pastorate. This is also about the time, 1937, that the Eli Lilly Pharmaceutical Company received its patent for insulin. And in 1937, Josiah Lilly and his sons, Eli Jr. and Josiah Jr., started the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And North American theological education and church life were never the same. As of 2023, the total assets of the Lilly Endowment, just as a by the way, were 62.2 billion. And that's just for the endowment. It has increased substantially since then because of weight loss and Alzheimer's drugs. So, what we have seen happen over this period of time is current events shaping the Christian community and how it goes about its gathering, upbuilding, and sending. We see a dramatic move from community-based formation embedded in lived experience to elite intellectual study. We see a change in who has access to the knowing and the experience of God and how that knowledge gets transmitted from the communities in the Didache to the elite academics. And now in the Brown-May study, we see the first comprehensive look at how that approach to formation in theological schools impacts the actual practice people are expected to do. This is my favorite chart in all of the Brown-May study, which is a 4-volume study. If your local theological library has it, I highly recommend pulling it out and taking a look at it. It's fascinating. So anytime I do any kind of um, presentation on the effectiveness of formation for ministry, I will find a way to use this chart. So 1934, the researchers decided to take a look at how effective the education or how important the education in seminary was compared to how difficult and important this work is in the pastorate. So if you take a look at this screen, the top black bar shows how important and difficult the activity of this area of work is. So for the first one, it's pastoral work in the community. And the second hash mark bar shows how helpful seminary education was in forming people for that work and training and upbuilding them for that work. So we see here for the first one that on a scale of 0 to 100, the importance and difficulty of pastoral work gets 100. It is super important and super hard work. And yet, seminary training only gets a 58. So put a pin in that. Seminary is not effective in training people in a practical art like pastoral care. The second one, the duties of ministry, ministerial duties. These are things like presiding at table, doing baptisms, presiding at funerals, liturgical sacramental tasks. The importance and difficulty gets an 86 out of 100. It's pretty important. The helpfulness of seminary education gets a 90 out of 100. This is what you want to see, that the actual work matches the degree to which the seminary was able to train people. When those two lines are pretty much equal, then you know the education was effective. Homiletics, 85 out of 100 in terms of importance and difficulty. Yeah, it's important work and it's challenging, but boy, did seminary education go overboard in training people how to do that. Administrative duties, they get a 67 out of 100 in importance and difficulty. Seminary wasn't very helpful with it. It only gets a 45. Educational tasks, this is back when the pastor used to be responsible for Sunday school, gets a 55. They pretty much trained people okay for that kind of church education. And civic gets a 10 and a 10. My hunch is today the civic one would be closer to 100 for the importance and difficulty of that work. And it would be interesting to see how helpful seminary education is in training people. So as you can see, for many of the practical tasks that are involved in doing ministry, the emphases that seminary education underscored during time in seminary don't really match up. So it was ever thus. This is the same thing people complain about after they graduate from seminary. Seminary didn't teach me how to do HR. Seminary didn't teach me how to do pastoral care. Seminary didn't teach me how to do the administrative duties and run an Excel spreadsheet and balance a budget. Um, and lead a staff and deal with an intransigent session. So there are two ways to approach this. One is to say, actually three, there might be more. One is to say, seminary really isn't cut out for that. I mean, you can't learn practical skills in a classroom. These are things that can probably only be learned while out in the field. Another is to say, seminary continues to emphasize some of the wrong things in its very traditional academic curriculum. And another is to say, perhaps seminary isn't the best place to be training people for the pastorate in the first place. Maybe we need to rethink what it means to prepare people adequately for a practices-based profession. So let's take a look at how things happened after this 1934 study. Fun little piece of trivia. This study was published in 1934. In 1936, the American Association of Theological Schools, now called ATS, decided to move into the work of accreditation. They looked at this study as a clarion call to oversee quality assurance in theological schools. And so the work of accreditation with ATS started about 2 years later. So this study ended up having a dramatic effect on how theological education, primarily through degree programs, is overseen and monitored. In the late 1950s and 60s, take a look at what was happening in the larger community. You've got the end of World War II. You've got the rise of professional education across all professions. This is the rise of a professional approach to education for education, medicine, nursing, law, accounting, all of the professions. And as a result, if you're going to take a professions-based approach to training people for practical arts-related jobs, you also have to think about all the things that you might not know to teach them or might not have time to teach them. So continuing education becomes mandatory during this time for most of these practices-based professions. In fact, you can't keep your credentials in medicine, accounting, education, um, cosmetology if you don't keep up a certain number of continuing education units each year, therapy, social work, etc. In fact, the only professions-based job where continuing education is not required is ministry. You have seminaries moving towards a deepened commitment to training people for ministry. So that becomes what they say they want people to do. But in many cases, there's little shift in the curricula. In fact, I used to work with a theological school that had its first revision of its curriculum for the Masters of Divinity program in 46 years while I was on staff there in the mid 2000s, like around 2010. Um, you have the church world kind of blowing up, church in the vernacular, liberation theologies, people recognizing the need to work for their own liberation and agency. You've got a kind of heady World War II optimism. We can do things. And a rise of the civil rights movement, recognizing that there's actually an underbelly to this optimism, that while the tide seems to be lifting these boats, there are numbers of people who don't have access to the same goods. For example, things like the GI Bill and the VA bill which funded education for large numbers of largely white people, but African American veterans not having access to the same goods and services their white counterparts did. At this time, during the rise of the civil rights movement, you've got the Vietnam War. You have the assassinations, particularly Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy. Earlier in the decade of the 60s, of course, you had JFK's assassination. And this begins the dismantling of trust in authorities and organizations. And this is stuff that we're continuing to reap today. In the 1970s, this continues with an explosion in seminary enrollment, with a rapid growth of congregations followed by a rapid decline. You've got the rise and the shift of the evangelical movement. This is the time when the Southern Baptist Convention declared its trenching into a particular conservative understanding of what it meant to be Southern Baptist. Prior to the 1980s, the evangelicals were actually at the forefront of social justice movements. During this time, you see more alignment intentionally with the political right. And you also have the beginning of all of the schisms in mainline Protestant denominations. This is in the church. On the civic and political side, you've got Watergate with Nixon's resignation. You've got the pullout from Vietnam. You've got inflation and deep economic crisis. How many of you guys might remember waiting in line to get gas in the mid 1970s? I was just in California. Let me tell you, it's $7 a gallon in Los Angeles. You've got the Reagan era deregulation, the firing of all of the air traffic controllers, and the heyday on Wall Street, Gordon Gekko and the like. From the 90s through the early 2000s, you have the continued fragmentation, loss of trust in institutions, focus on hyper-individualism, access to knowledge in your lap with a PC. This is when Apple develops the original 528K Mac, the putty colored one, and PCs become available. You have a steep decline in anything that involves participation in groups, whether they are civic or religious. You have 9/11. 2006. Seminaries are always a few years late to this. You've got the last year of steady increase in seminary enrollment. Now, mind you, ATS is reporting its first increase recently in degree program enrollment since 2006, after a two-decade decline, and rapid shifts in population demographics, with the United States moving towards no single racial ethnic group being dominant. And the Great Recession of 2008. And then we get into the fun stuff that we've been experiencing in the last decade. We've got the pandemic, we've got the political schisms, we've got political conflict, we've got political division, the election of Trump in 2016 after the election of the first Black president, Barack Obama. More fragmentation, and people are doing so much research into the well-being of clergy. The hot take is things aren't going well. Theological schools have been quite slow to shift to accommodate the needs of a fragmentation of congregational life and a rapid expansion of what counts as doing ministry work. It has been lifelong learning leaders and the industry of lifelong learning that has really been at the forefront of innovation, entrepreneurial change, just-in-time learning, and nimble pivoting to meet the needs of people in these days. Theological schools are still slow to catch up. If you don't believe me, take a look at what we said earlier in terms of the increased focus from theological school administrations on using lifelong learning as a way to increase enrollment in traditional degree programs and to bring revenue to those degree programs that have been declining. We've got a huge proliferation of lifelong learning programs. Much of it recently has been funded by the Lilly Endowment. Their Pathways to Learning has involved more than 163 theological schools receiving phase 2 grants to create new pathways to ministry that are outside of traditional degree programs. So, with this huge influx of more than $1 billion of money into theological schools and parachurch organizations to support formation for ministry, you've got a huge proliferation of these programs once again, as in the 1950s, with very little oversight to assure quality, coherence, and even any kind of coordination or communication among these organizations. So we are back where we were in the 1950s, and in some ways, we are back to where we were in the earliest formation of the Christian community. Um, oh, one of the other things I didn't mention is also the dismantling of news sources and the dismantling of shared narratives across divided communities. We now have people in their echo chambers. So this division, this fragmentation, this individualism, lots of folks developing individualized approaches to ministry formation, the closure of a number of seminaries. I don't know if you saw, Chicago Theological Seminary has just announced its closure. It's another historical seminary that is no longer accepting students. We are in a situation where we've got a theological proposition that is under a shared moniker of Christianity or ministry, with the dismantling of a notion that there can be shared almost anything, that the local becomes the primary expression people latch onto. The local is no longer connected to a larger entity. So, one of the things that I'm wondering is, in some ways, we're back to the beginning, to small, local, organic efforts. Lifelong learning programs are a deep expression of this. A return to the local contextual learner, taking into account a person's situation. Who are they ministering to? What is their background? What is their situation? Are they multivocational? Are they able to go to school? How are we going to deliver accessible theological education given the particulars of their context? We have a deep shift in epistemology. No longer is truth shared or coming from a single reliable source, but it's something that is generated and communicated locally so that people have their own truths with a small t. So the question that I have is, how should lifelong learning respond to these times? And what are the challenges of doing this work in these times? So what I'd like to do is take down the slideshow and ask folks to respond to these two questions. How should lifelong learning, respond to these times, and what are the challenges of doing work in this time? We've basically done a whistle-stop tour over 2,000 years, going from the local back to the local with a whole bunch of stuff in between, but it's not the same thing. If we're going to be like the Sankofa bird, what can we take from our past into our future? What's the egg worth bringing? But how does the future need to be different? So, if you guys are able to unmute and turn your cameras on, let's have a little bit of conversation about this. What are some key things from the past that strike you as being worth remembering and taking into your work today? Go ahead, unmute and share.
Now, I'll throw something out, Helen, as
Sure.
a first reflection. So the local in our time is a more stable place for people than institutions, which
Hmm.
is to say there's something pretty important going on about the stability of the local.
Hmm.
And if the institutions of theological education are going to continue to kind of shake in certain ways, it just informs where can we find stability in order to create sharedness.
Hmm.
Without stability, there's no sharedness.
Right.
right? So just as an arc of the story you shared, that the locality is such a high value ingredient to what the
Yeah.
work of lifelong learning involves. Yeah.
I think it's an important piece, not just educationally. I think people can only learn in their own skins and in their own places. Um, we have learned that there's no such thing as just abstract knowing. It always gets filtered through a person's experience. But particularly within the Christian community, I think what you're saying takes on theological resonance because within the Christian communion, we believe in something called the incarnation, which is this idea that God becomes known and fully present to human beings only through the lived historical expression of the person of Jesus of Nazareth and his life, death, and resurrection. So, how does one then create a learning opportunity, a sense of identity and connection that affirms the local in the midst of an unstable collective, as you describe it, but also provides us something that we can share across difference, in a way that affirms the local. So I'm just throwing that out there. Any hot takes?
But Kate put a comment in the chat about the thinking about the work of forming community and the
Hmm.
role of placemaking, the concrete and the particular. And I was thinking sort of as part of that, the importance of relationships
Hmm.
in throughout all of that.
Hmm.
The being, if we are Imago Dei relating to other people with made in the image of God and doing this work, um, whether we all agree or not, there's a great deal of particularity in that.
Kate, can you say more about what you dropped into the chat? I think this is really important, reflecting too on Sarah's observations about relationality.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone hear me okay? Okay,
Sure can.
great. Yeah, I mean, I, I'm just thinking, I'm just thinking about the role of making community, and that is just one of the most central things that it feels like is part of our work.
Hmm.
And the community is absolutely particular. And also, I think in our times, I mean, look, we're a community and we are extended over multiple states, multiple institutions, multiple ways of being,
Hmm.
multiple religious traditions and affiliations. That there's something about that, but pulling that back to the place and the particularity of place is really important. So, yeah, I'm thinking about especially like rituals. The
Hmm.
Didache is standing out to me. Um, Rituals in community, and yeah, that the local church and the local theology here are very particular and concrete. So, who I am as a person, my particular understanding of the human condition. Um, of suffering as well as hopes of fulfillment are shaped in a particular place by a particular community and and by many different communities, right? And
Hmm.
so for me, I think there's some tension here in holding that together, as well as thinking about how do we, in our work of lifelong learning, help to shape and form those communities? How do we give people the skills to shape and form community, to shape and form place, which um, I think sometimes is a work of community development, right? Like
Hmm.
how do we invite people to like learn how to have a meal together? How to hold space for ritual and community, especially if they are not. I mean, I think about all the young people who are making community in a whole different kind of way, right? The desire
Hmm.
hasn't changed, but the
Right.
context has. Does that make sense? These are kind of like all over the place thoughts, but just a few ones.
Anybody want to dive in and comment on this? Go ahead, Daryl.
So I'm I'm wondering about the distinction between the professionalization of theology,
Hmm.
that is the academic professional theologian Thomas Aquinas, and the professionalization of the formation of community leaders, pastors,
Hmm.
or other community leaders. And this localization seems to be a reclaiming of, it could be reclaiming of both. One is that, theology is not done universally and then trickles down to specific expressions of a universal, but rather we're with liberation theology and contextual theologies, we're seeing theology emerging from the experiences of particular people in particular places and experiences of the holy and sacred in community. So that's one way, kind of a deprofessionalization of the theology. But also, I'm wondering if we're seeing a reclaiming of the leadership, the
Hmm.
formation of leaders as well, particularly in the trend towards licensing instead of ordination within many denominations. Ordination requires that you become a professional theologian. Licensing allows a lay person with minimal training to lead a community of faith, for example.
Mhm.
These comments are making me think of a couple of different threads of conversation we've had in Alam. One is the unique gift of lifelong learning for ministry as emphasizing andragogy, an approach to adult-centered learning that takes into account the lived experience of the people who are in the learning process, which really goes back to the Didache, doesn't it? Where people are reflecting on lived experience. I'm also thinking, Daryl, of what you just said in terms of the move of liberation theology. There's liberative pedagogy as part of that too. Paulo Freire, who pointed out that the most efficacious learning is not learning that is content we deliver to people intact, but rather reflection on experience in a way that expands people's fluency with being able to speak to that experience. So it's not just an affirming of where people are. It happens in place, but there's also this growth that takes place as they find new language and new ways of encountering their lived experiences. It's an imaginative capacity that's expanded. And what I hear often from theological school faculty who are trained to their guilds and from administrations is a concern about effective content delivery. That there's a certain amount of stuff people need to know and have in order to be able to function effectively as ministers. What you're saying, Kate, is that there are certain functions and capacities people should be able to do in order to be able to function effectively as pastors. It's not just having a lot of knowledge. And I do wonder if that is one of the growing edges for theological schools. It's a competency approach. I think it's even more than competency. I think it's competency in terms of being able to do a thing, but also to do a thing while knowing oneself to be part of a larger community of others who are doing this thing as well. So, this idea of forming community and working with groups of people in place and a return to the local also always has to be coupled with the conversation with things outside of that local that would continue to grow and expand that local community's capacity to know itself and know itself in relationship with God and with each other. Because we don't want to have the hyperlocal to be the gated communities that pretty much exist on social media today. We want it to be something that affirms the local and lived experience, but also allows for different people to be sitting at that table that you've described setting.
Well, for some people and some um, uh, Christian leaders, that community that local community is not um, align very well with their own identity and experience. And so to have this wider community that gives access to help to form and give perspective, and to have an interplay of both, I think is what, to me, what I'm trying
Mhm.
to do. Because I mean, all this great content for ministry that has was been formed over the ages that includes, for example, almost no female voices, and yet
Mhm.
female voices are, have a great deal to add. Not, I mean, that's necessary for us who are female who are doing this, but that also the church more generally, I think would benefit from hearing. And then the same thing for different ethnic voices and for LGBTQ voices and, so and for rural folks in rural settings versus urban settings, so that gets multiplied all around. So, but we have folks who are in rural settings who don't have access to other folks in rural settings, but who need to have that
Mhm.
interplay.
Mhm.
You understand what I'm saying? So,
In his commentary on Acts, and I totally recommend it to all of you if you've not read it, Willie Jennings talks about lines and circles. He talks about lines in, so to have a community, you've got to have folks who are outside the community. Otherwise, it's not really a community. There's a certain kind of coherence and identity to a community. So there are insiders and outsiders. But part of what he posits is how porous is that community and how capable is that community to create an ever broadening circle that includes more instead of just separating people out. He also talks about lines that separate or lines that connect. And um, one of the things that I love about the image of the Sankofa bird is, above all things, it's in motion. It is moving. It is not a static image. It is constantly looking back, moving forward, taking what's useful, bringing the egg, which one assumes will hatch at some point in the future. And any idea of how to do education, of how to do formation, of how to form community, particularly as lifelong learning leaders, that doesn't have some kind of capacity to learn and differentiate and deepen and grow is not going to be one that's an adequate one to bring into the future. Because contexts and times change, as we've seen. Now, one of the interesting things is that historically, lifelong learning has played a kind of catch-up role to like a responsive role to the changes that are happening. We're now getting to the point where within particularly theological education, lifelong learning and non-degree education may become, and I'll use a metaphor here just for you, Israel, the tail that wags the dog, meaning that it becomes the thing that becomes the dominant way of doing education in these communities. This is a good time for those who lead lifelong learning programs to think intentionally about what formation for leadership within faith communities and effective participation within those faith communities needs to look like, and to begin to set that agenda moving forward, as opposed to simply reacting to gaps in a seminary education, larger cultural shifts, things that are happening. Oh my gosh, these people don't have access. We have to create access. We need to be setting some of that agenda and creating with intentionality the future that we want to see for formation. Wow, we are already at 1 o'clock. Are there any last comments or thoughts that people have
Oh,
before I share less? Yes, David,
I've
please.
just got a million things that ran through my brain with because Nazarene Church right now is going through a major shift right now
Right.
with our theological education. Last 10 years, last 20 years, curriculum revision. What I'm curious about, though, just to ask real quickly, is since that Brown study, are there any other newer studies, more recent, that have shown the alignment or lack of alignment between pastoral skill and what the seminary is delivering?
I am so glad you asked. Actually, there's a terrific study done by Debbie Jin and Joanne Deasy from ATS that was just published in recent years. Daryl, if you have easy access to the URL for that study, I would be so grateful for you to drop that into the chat. They do a periodic review of alums of theological schools to ask, what's your experience been like and how effective was your education? And they did do a peer-reviewed article that shows basically seminaries are getting it wrong still.
Still,
So
okay.
even after almost 100 years of accreditation and quality assurance, seminaries are still getting it wrong. And I have thoughts about that. I think it may be in large part due to the fact that the primary delivery modality for the education is the faculty themselves, who are trained by and to their academic guilds rather than the pastorate. And all of their training is to perform for that guild. So even folks who say, I was a pastor for a number of years and then I got my PhD and I went into teaching, the experience of pastoring that they had was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, which things have changed. The priorities are very different. And what the guild demands of its people is quite different than what the church asks of its people. So, anyways, I would highly recommend this study. Please go ahead and access it. Is it open access, Daryl? Do you remember? It is. Okay, great. Um, Great question. So, yeah, short version is we continue to get it wrong. And in fact, Debbie and Joanne give lifelong learning continuing education programs a significant shout out and talk about the need to be much more flexible about the approach to education, which could be part of the reason why ATS is starting to become very interested in non-degree learning at this point.
Got it. Thank you.
So, in closing, um, two favorites here. We've got Neighbor and T.S. Eliot. In 1956, H. Richard Niebuhr wrote that a theological education which does not lead young men and women, I'm really impressed with the fact that he included women in this in 1956, to embark on a continuous, ever incomplete, but ever sustained effort to study and to understand the meaning of their work and of the situation in which they labor. That's a shout out to you, Kate, is neither theological nor education. And T.S. Eliot's poetic take on a Sankofa bird. We shall not cease from our exploration, and at the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So thanks so much, everybody. The recording of this will be available on the Alum website. It is going to be launched soon. It's taking a little longer than we thought, but it's going to be brand new and have lots of bells and whistles it didn't have before. If you're a member, you'll have access through the member portal of prior webinars. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Are you going to slide deck available or not? Maybe.